Welcome to Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad, a podcast dedicated to amplifying and elevating Afro-Latinx histories, cultures, and communities across the Americas and beyond. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Reed Vasquez. Join us for conversations with experts and artists to learn more about Afro-Latinidad. Venga! Today's guest is Dr. Nancy López. Dr. López is professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico, where she co-founded and directs the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice. Her scholarship, teaching, and service are guided by the insights of intersectionality. And Dr. López is author of Hopeful Girls, Troubled Boys, Race and Gender Disparity in Urban Education, published in 2003, co-editor of Creating Alternative Discourses in Education of Latinas and Latinos, from 2003, also from 2003, Mapping Race, Critical Approaches to Health Disparities Research in 2013, and most recently in 2023, Quant Crit, an Anti-Racist Approach to Education Equity. Her current research on intersectionality as inquiry and praxis, race, gender, class, ethnicity for student success in STEM is funded by the Hispanic Serving Institution STEM Education Program at the National Science Foundation. Thank you so much for joining me today, Nancy.
It's such a joy and a pleasure to be here in community with you.
So we will jump right in. So I know you grew up in New York City, the Lower East Side, the daughter of Dominican immigrants, and then you went on to become the first woman of the African diaspora to be tenured and promoted to full professor in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of New Mexico. So tell us about your journey, especially as it relates to the evolution of your interests in Afro-Latinidad.
Yes, I think it started with having a strong mama. So my mother came to the U.S. in the 1960s, and as a Black Dominican woman, navigated so many obstacles. And she never had the privilege of pursuing education beyond the second grade, but also taught her 5 children that she raised by herself that in Spanish, she would tell me, no dejes que nadie robe tu derecho, ni tu felicidad. Don't let anyone rob you of your rights or your joy. And so I think my journey was absolutely framed by having a very strong Black Dominican mama who really showed us how to fight for justice, how to navigate systems of oppression, and how to find joy in doing that. So in many ways, growing up, I was born and raised in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, Loisaida. I went to public schools and, de facto segregated schools, had the opportunity to participate in some of these programs like Head Start, Upward Bound, that created equity lifts for many folks who were coming from backgrounds like mine. That made the difference for me, right? Both a strong mom and also these programs that were really the way to distribute resources for communities like ours. And growing up in public housing was also formative for me, recognizing the inequities, right? The injustices in terms of housing conditions and access to resources also created this visceral awareness of, anti-Blackness, racial discrimination, and injustice, and how we all have a role to play.
Mm-hmm. What would you say? I'm just thinking about your mom and her influence, but also, and I'm wondering if they're either including her or other moments in your journey, if there are 1 or 2 defining episodes or moments that you're like, that was it, or this over here was it, or that the thing that someone said in that moment that really captured you and propelled you forward in this work that you do.
So I was actually at Columbia University in the 1980s when I met Dr. Clara Rodriguez, who herself is not Afro-Boricua, but is in solidarity. And she did a lot of work with the census. And I think the Visibility Project, the idea that race, which has a visual component, is not equivalent and cannot be measured in the same question as ethnicity, was something that Dr. Clara Rodriguez wrote about in her book, Puerto Ricans in the United States. So that deeply influenced me. At the same time, there was a major conference that was sponsored at Lehman College. And it was like the inauguration of an Institute for Dominican Studies. And I met Dr. Ramon Hernandez, who was doing similar work. And then as a graduate student, I had the privilege of taking courses with Dr. Silvio Torres Sayant,
Mm-hmm.
a Black Dominican scholar who is a trailblazer, and collaborated with my colleague, Dr. Janetta Candelario,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote Black Behind the Ears, Dominican Racial Identity from Museums to Beauty Shops. I also had the privilege of meeting Mira Jimenez Roman and Juan Flores, and being involved in the Afro-Latino Forum. All of these were, I think, transformational moments. And then I'll recall also that when I was an undergrad, I took a course on Latino literature and Latin American literature, and I came across Nicolás Guillen's poem El Apellido, the last name, talking
Mm-hmm.
about how he could not trace his African ancestors. So all of it, the confluence of all of these amazing opportunities that and resources that I came into contact was very defining in terms of not only is it an ethical imperative to make visible the experiences of Black Latinos, Afro Latinos, but also to engage in praxis that would create a more just distribution of resources, again, whether that's housing, educational opportunity, health outcomes. Thomas Levis is another amazing Afro Latino scholar who has written about the imperative of making visible the health inequity among Black Latinos. So again, there's too many people to name: Josefina Baez, Loida Maritza Perez, and Geographies of Home, and now she's executive director of Afromundo.
Yeah.
Ariana Curtis and her transformational work in Afro-Panameña in the Smithsonian. I am so grateful that I have come across so many scholars, activists, community advocates that have dedicated their entire lives to making visible and also advancing justice for the Afro-Latino community and all its wonderful diversity.
Yeah, the names you're listing, I'm just like, these are, the greats, the foundational, inspirational figures in the work that we do. So that is amazing to know that you have had those moments where they have continued to kind of buoy you and propel you forward. And I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned visibility. I know you're passionate about Afro-Latinidad in the framework of visibility, but also the distribution of resources. And so if you could talk a little bit more about how you're drawn to these areas, especially as it connects to the work that you do.
Interestingly enough, when a lot of these changes that have happened, I think everyone knows that in 2024, March, the Office of Management and Budget released new guidelines that essentially combine race and ethnicity into one question, which is extremely problematic and has been completely questioned by scholars of race. In fact, we have a grant, Dr. Yasmini Disari and Dr. Edward Vargas and I have a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on the urgency, and I would say the imperative, the ethical imperative to employ intersectionality as inquiry and praxis in revising these guidelines. Part of the work that we've been doing is we submitted a response to the call for comments
Mm-hmm.
before this change occurred in April of 2023, where 100 race and ethnicity, primarily race and ethnicity scholars, agreed that race and ethnicity are not the same thing, that there's a long history of why, especially in Latino communities where the enslavement of Africans and indigenous people began, we need to maintain that analytical distinction if we care about um, inequities and anti-Blackness. So I call it statistical gaslighting
Mm.
simply because I want to call attention to the fact that for decades, it's not the first time that this issue has come up. People have pointed out that if we pretend that all Latinos are the same race, or if we create the myth that there are some Latinos who are just Latino, and then there's those other ones that are Black Latinos and Indigenous Latinos and Asian Latinos, etc., or MENA Latinos, then we are, regardless of good intentions, contributing to anti-Blackness. When we create the myth that if we do a national test that absolutely does not target Latino strata in their testing, that is where the majority of Afro Latinos live, and that this is a conclusive test, that as was done by the Census Bureau, on whether or not a combined question will reduce the count of Afro-Latinos and whether or not we've made a dent in racialized poverty, then that is, in my opinion, not only unethical, but really scholarly, from a scholarship point of view, very problematic. So, yes, I've been very passionate about that. I've collaborated with colegas at the University of California to produce a report that was called Centering Black Latinidad and Complex Inequalities, and that's available online. And one of the things that we learned is that because in 2020, even though we didn't have the combined question, we put origins by race boxes, which is very problematic because it's almost implying that particular
Mm-hmm.
races are representative of a nation. That
Right.
is the definition of racism. Then we couldn't even use that data. We had to use 2019 data. But what did we find? That although Afro-Latinos in this, the American Community Survey, have higher levels of education, we still have lower home ownership. We
Mm-hmm.
also have higher poverty rates. And this is not new. Howard Hogan has also done research showing that Afro Latinos and other Latinos that are not white live in neighborhoods with higher poverty rates. So, again, why the analytical distinction between race as a visual status? I call it street race. If you're out in public, what race do you think others who do not know you would assume you are based on what you look like, which includes skin color, but also facial features, hair texture, all of that. And for those who might say, well, I'm mixed race and, I'm racially ambiguous. Well, ask yourself, are you subjected to anti-Blackness? Because it's true. Most of us probably have an ancestor who would have been subjected to anti-Blackness, but that doesn't mean that you yourself are experiencing that. So, thinking about the importance again of, even though these changes have come forward that say, yes, let's ask about what is your race and or ethnicity in one question, which really erases our ability to look at racialized poverty. Why don't you consider adding a separate question on race that clarifies what you're asking? What
Mm-hmm.
is your race or visual status? Now, I'm not asking about your ancestry. I'm asking about how are you treated when you walk out in public? And then the second question could be, what is your cultural heritage? For that first question, check one box, the one that most represents how you would be treated when you show up to look for an apartment or when you're in the ER.
Mm-hmm.
That's what solidarity is about. That is what we can do. The guidelines do not prohibit us from adding additional questions. So I would say, if you care about the visibility, but also rectifying any injustice that Afro Latinos are subjected to, then I would make sure that I add separate questions. And for the race question, instruct people to answer by checking one box that most represents how they're racialized.
Mm-hmm. No, I was just reading a piece by Tanya Hernandez about kind of this shift that's happening in Latin America versus the U.S. So the U.S. is trying to collapse the categories, and then Latin America, they're finally expanding the categories to try to enumerate blackness and Afro Latin Americans. And so it's been very interesting seeing this kind of this evolution or de-evolution that's happening in the U.S. about not wanting to count those elements.
I
Um,
actually co-authored an op-ed with Alan Aha on the, collapsing or making race and ethnicity co-equal contributes to the myth of a post-racial US. It's not true. We still are treated according to what we look like. And so to pretend that ethnicity and race are the same thing contributes to white supremacy
mhm,
because it erases our ability to discern if there is an inequity in housing, in health, in employment, in education, even in criminal justice. So again, it is an interesting phenomena. And I ask, who's afraid of keeping separate questions? Who benefits when we collapse race and ethnicity into one question? And who is hurt?
mhm,
If our ethical principle is do no harm, then we must always consider who will be impacted. And, to pretend that we can just fix this after the fact, we know that this is already doing harm. It's already made Afro Latino communities less visible. It's reduced the numbers and, again, impeded our ability to see whether or not my cousins, many of the Afro-Latino part of my family, because Dominicans could be white, could be Afro-Latino, could be so many other different racial statuses. Many of us who grew up in the projects happen to be Afro-Latino, and
Mm-hmm.
many of those who were white adjacent, or at least, certainly not visibly Black, did not. And so what does that have to do with housing discrimination? What does that have to do with anti-Blackness? And what are the intergenerational wealth transfers that might be happening along the color line for all of us? So Tanya Hernandez's work has been transformational, because her latest book, Racial
Mm-hmm.
Innocence and
Mm-hmm.
Anti-Black Latino Bias, is incredibly important for illustrating how in the civil rights arena, whether we're talking about housing, employment, or any other outcome, there is anti-Blackness. And for us to pretend that it's not there
Mm-hmm.
is not practicing solidarity.
No, absolutely. And I'm thinking a little bit too about, because the show is looking at kind of across the hemisphere on Afro-Latinidad and how that also plays out. And I'm wondering how your work helps with those connections with the transnational elements of the Afro-Latino community and the Latino community more broadly in the work that you do.
So I think that it is opening the possibility for presenting a case to the United Nations.
Mm,
And the reason I raise that is because right now we have a global movement, as you mentioned, in Latin America and across the globe, to make visible anti-Blackness. And here we're having the opposite happen
mhm,
in the United States, that has a record of trying to undo, structural racism and anti-Blackness. So it is possible that through the work of global organizations that are working on the African diaspora, that we can come to consensus and present a case to the United Nations on whether or not this statistical gaslighting is a violation of human rights,
mm,
and also contributing to a structural anti-Blackness by erasing the Afro-Latino community, not only here, but if it's happening in Latin America as well, or in any other corner of the globe. I think that we can learn a lot from our indigenous brothers and sisters, many of whom are also Afro-Latino, right?
mhm,
I'm
mhm,
thinking about Pablo Lopez Oro
mhm,
and the work that he's doing in this arena, as well as so many others. So I think that there is a moment for what Patricia Hill Collins calls flexible solidarity. And I want to point out that there are white Latinos who have been acting in solidarity, and there are at least two scholarly associations who have also signed on to the call to maintain the analytical distinction in data collection for race as a visual social status
mhm,
and ethnicity as cultural heritage. So they are the minority. Many of the so called Latino civil rights groups have endorsed this combined question,
mhm.
which, again, regardless of intent, is contributing to the erasure and to the falsehood that Blackness exists outside of Latinidad.
Mhm. I mean, it's like the more work that gets done, the more work gets undone. And so, yeah, just it's constantly having to remind people that this is not, you can't, just because erase, take something off, take a question off, doesn't mean it's going to go away. And to be able to, like you said, for for scholars, looking to make sure that that visibility is kept ever present. It's just critical. And I know you
For
mentioned. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that a lot of people dismiss it as something that's just about scholarship. Oh, it's just about a study. No, this is about distribution of resources. This is about making sure that when we're reporting something like COVID mortality,
Hmm.
that we're not just lumping all Latinos and pretending that Blackness exists outside of Latinidad. It is specifically about making sure that employment discrimination, one of the other findings I forgot to mention from the UCLA report on centering Black Latinidad, is that Afro-Latinas, like ourselves, we have higher levels of labor force participation than Latinas who are not Black, and then Black women who are not Latina. But that doesn't become visible unless you have separate questions. And I again explained how we had to use 2019 data that
Mm-hmm.
did not conflate those two concepts in order to make that visible. The 2020 data was unusable
Yeah.
because even though it wasn't the exact combined question, it was a step in that direction and erased our ability to make that inequity visible.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned several kind of urgent issues, the visibility, the resources, anything else that you think that were really critical, that people need to understand, that why this is so important.
Well, I know right now that there's an effort to erase curriculum on the teaching of anything related to race or ethnic
Mm-hmm.
studies or intersectionality, etc. I think that we need to get very active in what's happening in K 12 because if we are not, then the erasure will be complete, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I mentioned that it wasn't until really when I was an undergrad that I came across any of this writing by Afro-Latinos or any of the research on, the statistical status or the socioeconomic inequities, that's too late. That needs to be happening in K 12. And so I think one of the things that we need to make a priority in our community is making sure that not only are the study of race and ethnicity, ethnic studies visible, but within what we call Latino studies, that Afro-Latinidad is centered
Mm-hmm.
and that we do not contribute again to the myth that Afro-Latinidad exists outside of Latinidad and that, these two things are different. So I think that, yeah, that's a challenge to all the Latino studies departments to work with your K-12 teachers who are experiencing a lot of threats to their ability to do their jobs. And so we need to collaborate. A lot of that can happen with teacher training programs in colleges of ed to make sure that in history courses and literature courses that we are centering Black Latinidad, Black Latina perspectives, etc., and that we're intersectional about it, that we are talking about differences by not only gender, but also by class. So I mentioned both of my parents did not have the privilege of earning a degree beyond the second grade. That as an Afro Latina, yes, I am subjected to gendered anti-blackness, but how that might be navigated by someone who had parents who made themselves be Afro Latino but had 4-year college degrees may look
Mm-hmm.
different, right? And to be cognizant of that, sexuality, immigration status, disability, all of those things, right? That at baseline, we need to make sure that we are working with our K 12 teachers to support their professional development, but also learn from them in terms of how we can support our students in higher ed as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So we are nearing the end of our conversation, but I always like to ask, in addition to the work that you do, and certainly all the scholars that you mentioned in our conversation, are there any other specific resources that you recommend to people who are interested in learning more about this topic or the communities, websites? I think you mentioned the Black Latinos No Collective, but are there any other resources that you want to make sure people know about?
Absolutely. The Black Latinas No Collective has been an oasis for me and a
Mm-hmm.
source of such inspiration. And I cited Dinzy Flores and her leadership in establishing, and everyone else is part of that family. I mentioned, the Afro Latino Forum and Jose Perea in his incredible and transformational leadership. Latino is Not a Race campaign that was signed on by, I can't tell you how many organizations, not only the United States, but abroad, opposing the combination of race and ethnicity in federal guidelines. Afro-Latino Forum, Loida Maritza Perez and her work in that arena, El Colectivo Ile. I mean, there are just too many resources out there that are doing incredible work to create a space for not only learning, but also for action, right?
Mm-hmm.
For liberation. We will not be free until Afro Latinos are free and Afro Latina transgender women are free, etc. So really, it is about an intersectional praxis of solidarity, recognizing that we're different. Latinos, of course, are different by all those axes of difference that I mentioned, but that we can all be part of one family um, and address the inequities that we see, and specifically in this case, anti-blackness in our communities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for such a powerful conversation and for all the wonderful resources and just the significance of all this. I really appreciate discussing this with you. And I look forward to all the wonderful things coming out of the work that you're doing now and in the future.
Thank you for inviting and for creating this space. I look forward to the next opportunity.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and hear more episodes of Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And go to michellereedvasquez.com to check out our episode resources and learn more about the Afro-Latinidad Studies Institute.